Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Once again, thanks for all of you who sponsor the podcast by becoming patrons at patreon.com/The History Network. And this week, special thanks to Stephen Lang, author, for signing up. Thank you to all of you once again who have become patrons. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 27, Episode 4, The British Campaign in Egypt, 1801, Part 1. This episode was written by Simon Quinn. Simon is a postdoctoral research fellow in history at the University of York. He has recently completed a PhD studying the lives of British soldiers on campaign in Egypt in 1801. If one were to ask about the contribution of the British Army during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, some of the immediate responses would concern the Duke of Wellington, the Peninsular War and the Battle of Waterloo. These subjects have acquired great fame over the past 2 decades, thanks in part to Bernard Cornwall's popular Sharpe novels and to the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo in 2015. However, the battles fought at Waterloo and in the Spanish Peninsula were only a fraction of those fought by the British Army during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. One British campaign that has largely been forgotten was fought in Egypt in 1801. Although the numbers of men who fought in Egypt were far smaller than in later campaigns in Spain, Portugal and Belgium, Egypt nevertheless proved a turning point in the fortunes of the British Army. The significance of the Egyptian campaign can still be felt to this day. The origins of the Egyptian campaign began on the 1st of July 1798, when a French army of 40,000 men commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte disembarked from their transports at Alexandria and seized the city. By the end of July, the French had defeated the forces of the ruling Mamluk regime and had occupied Cairo. News of the invasion alarmed the British government. Napoleon's battle-hardened army now posed a significant threat to the British Empire in India. This concern was short-lived, however. On the 1st of August 1798, Horatio Nelson's naval squadron annihilated the French fleet that had escorted Napoleon's army to Egypt at the Battle of the Nile. On reading reports of Nelson's victory, Lord Grenville, the Foreign Secretary, jubilantly wrote of his certainty that the French garrison would rot away through disease and homesickness. Subsequent events reinforced this view. In the spring of 1799, Napoleon's advance into Israel was halted at the walls of Acre and forced into retreat. By August 1799, Napoleon had abandoned his army and returned to France. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy blockaded French ports along the Mediterranean and Red Sea coast, preventing all but a trickle of supplies that the French army in Egypt required. It seemed the French occupation of Egypt could do little harm. All this changed as the war in Europe began to swing in France's favour. At the end of 1798, several European monarchical powers had joined a military alliance against France known as the Second Coalition. Led by Austria, Britain and Russia, the coalition's goal was to contain the expansion of the new French Republic and restore the monarchy in France that had been overthrown by the Revolution in 1789. Within a year of its formation, the coalition was close to collapse. After a disastrous campaign in Holland in the autumn of 1799, Russia abandoned the alliance. In the following summer, Austria was defeated at Marengo in Italy and forced on the defensive in Germany. The Austrians attained a temporary armistice, which became permanent after a crushing defeat at Hohenlinden on 3rd of December 1800. Britain had bankrolled the Second Coalition, and this huge expenditure was crippling the country's finances. Added to this, poor harvests at home had brought riots and malnutrition to many cities. It was clear Britain would be unable to continue the war much longer. Cabinet ministers agreed to begin peace negotiations with the French, but Egypt remained a sticking point. Napoleon's army was still in firm possession of the country. The French were determined to hold on to Egypt during peace negotiations, and it seemed likely they would launch an invasion of India from Egypt as soon as war broke out again. For Henry Dundas, the Home Secretary, there was only one option: an immediate military strike against the French occupation force in Egypt. As the director of the Board of Control for India, Dundas had devoted many years of his career to the colony and refused to watch this be undone by the enemy. On the 3rd of October 1800, Dundas won the approval of the cabinet for an expedition to Egypt with the barest possible majority. Dundas's expedition had many powerful opponents. Both Lord Grenville, the Foreign Secretary, and William Windham, the Secretary for War, were openly hostile to the plan. They wanted to keep the pressure on France directly, either by supporting Britain's allies should they decide to re-enter the war, or by lending aid to counter-revolutionary rebels in France. To commit Britain's only strike force to the furthest corner of the Mediterranean would mean the end of offensive operations in Europe for the foreseeable future, and the British Isles would be left stripped of its defences. In short, it would be an admission of defeat in the war for continental Europe. Added to this, there were considerable logistical problems of campaigning so far from home, and Britain's recent track record in campaigns outside Europe had been dreadful. Throughout the 1790s, a series of expeditions sent to capture the French West Indian colonies had suffered appalling casualties to yellow fever and malaria. It was assumed that Egypt possessed a similar climate to the West Indies, hence it was thought to contain a similar assortment of lethal diseases. Bubonic plague in particular was known to be a common affliction. If an expeditionary force was sent to Egypt, Grenville and Windham believed that few would return. In their desperation, these two men appealed to King George III, who agreed that the Egyptian expedition was an unnecessary risk. The concerns of these men were ignored by Dundas, and heated exchanges followed. An exasperated Windham wrote in his diary, "People would say that we had lost one army in a contest with yellow fever, and now we are going with another to try our hand upon the plague." Supporters and opponents of the Egyptian campaign went on arguing long after the decision to send the expedition, pre-echoing similar moments in 1915 and 1940. The reservations of these politicians and the king were to be heaped upon the man who was to lead the expedition. It was clear that a steady hand was needed. The task was given to Sir Ralph Abercrombie, a cousin and friend of Henry Dundas. This small, quiet, affable and well-mannered Scottish nobleman was 66 years of age. He was a veteran of the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence. More recently, he had served in the two failed invasions of Holland in 1795 and 1799, and had led an expeditionary force to the West Indies in 1796. Some of the cabinet members regarded him with distrust. Lord Grenville, in particular, resented his refusal to press on and exploit the initially successful landing in Holland in 1799. Abercrombie had recognised from the outset that the campaign was doomed to fail, and while his caution saved the lives of his men, he enraged Grenville. While Abercrombie possessed a proven record, there was some genuine concern about his suitability for command in Egypt. How would Abercrombie, at 66 years of age, cope with the physical demands of campaigning? It was well known that the general possessed exceptionally poor eyesight. He could see nothing without a telescope, and relied on his staff to keep him abreast of developments in battle. Another fault was his tendency to expose himself unnecessarily to danger on the front line, which meant he lost touch with the greater strategic situation as battle developed. Yet, for all of Abercrombie's faults, he was a very able commander. He had distinguished himself during the campaigns in Holland and the West Indies, despite the failures of these operations. The plan that the British cabinet had devised for the Egyptian campaign was both ambitious and ridiculous. 2 separate armies were to converge on Egypt and force a French surrender. Abercrombie was given the main task. He would lead 17,000 men from their station at Gibraltar and attempt an amphibious landing on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. A second force of 8,000 men under General David Baird sailed from Bombay in January 1801. They were to search for a landing point on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea and from there advance towards Cairo. These 2 forces were to coordinate their advance with an Ottoman army of 15,000 men that would march on the Egyptian capital from Jaffa. This huge pincer movement relied on careful timing and synchronized movement. However, it was impossible for these separate armies to coordinate their movements while they were hundreds, if not thousands, of miles apart. To make matters worse, the plan was based on a woeful underestimation of French forces in Egypt. The British government guessed that the 40,000 men Napoleon had taken to Egypt in 1798 had shrunk over the last few years to approximately 13,000. In fact, the French numbered well over 30,000. Abercrombie was completely unaware that he would be leading a campaign against a force twice the size of his own. This daunting task was not helped by the substandard quality of Abercrombie's army. Only 10 of his 26 battalions had combat experience, and many of the recruits were very poorly trained. Their condition reflected the army as a whole. By 1801, the 8th year of the war, the British had yet to defeat the French in battle. The army's performance in the 9 months prior to the Egyptian campaign was nothing short of embarrassing. 3 separate amphibious assaults were launched in 1800, and each was abandoned at the last minute. Lord Cornwallis, the veteran general who had infamously surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, wrote that the British army had become the scorn and laughing-stock of friends and foes. At Minorca and later Malta, Abercrombie was given over a month to train his army into a respectable force and prepare them for an amphibious landing on the coast of Egypt. This time would prove invaluable, as the ageing general was an exceptional trainer of men. He had decades of experience commanding inadequately trained regiments containing idiotic and ignorant officers. His subordinate, Major General John Moore, was a huge asset in this regard and has been described as one of the best instructors in the history of the British Army. By late November 1800 the army was ready. Abercrombie intended to land at Marmaris Bay on the southern coast of Turkey, spend a few days loading up everything needed for the invasion, and sail for Egypt immediately. When the army's flotilla sailed into Marmaris Bay on New Year's Eve 1800, they discovered that the Turks would not supply them. Letters and diaries written at this time are filled with invectives levelled at the Turks that drew heavily on racist stereotypes. This criticism was unwarranted. The British had wrongly presumed that the Turks would cooperate with them against the French. The Ottomans had, with British assistance, successfully repulsed Napoleon at the Siege of Acre in March 1799, but since then the 2 offensive campaigns against the French had both ended in disaster, at Aboukir in July 1799 and Heliopolis in March 1800. They were understandably reluctant to launch a 3rd offensive. With reports of Russian troops massing on Turkey's northern border, they saw little reason to send more troops to Egypt or part with their supplies. Instead of a few days, the army spent 7 weeks at Marmaris. Supplies were foraged and purchased while the men trained hard for the planned amphibious landing. But these 7 weeks were tortuously frustrating for Abercrombie. Time was of the essence. He had hoped to land in Egypt and surprise the French before they could entrench themselves. The longer the British stayed on the Turkish coast, the greater the chance that the French would learn of their presence and prepare their defences. After intelligence confirmed that 2 French frigates had slipped the British blockade and docked in Alexandria, Abercrombie could wait no longer. The risk of more reinforcements reaching the French was simply too great, and the army set sail for Egypt on the 22nd of February. Much of the equipment and resources required for the campaign had not been obtained. They lacked proper landing craft, medical supplies, and most significantly horses. Abercrombie was all too aware his army was ill-equipped for their task ahead. The general wrote in a letter to his cousin, "The enterprise is arduous and perhaps doubtful. I do not wish you to consider this a desponding letter. I certainly, however, am not confident of success." Abercrombie's subordinates shared his concerns. John Moore did not believe that the French would offer a pitched battle, and instead feared they would use their superiority in cavalry to constantly harass the British into submission. The amphibious landing caused the greatest concern. Before oil, coal and steam provided a means of propulsion, ships relied on the wind in their sails and the ocean currents. This dependence on the whims of nature made an amphibious landing on hostile shores incredibly perilous. Boats filled with men could capsize in the choppy surf or collide with one another. The journey to shore was often excruciatingly slow, and all the while the men on board would be exposed to enemy artillery. Small, flimsy wooden landing boats were easily penetrated and sunk by artillery and small arms fire. Should this happen, many on board would drown. It was rare for military servicemen to possess any swimming ability, and the soldiers were weighed down by more than 60 pounds of equipment. If they survived the approach, these exhausted and seasick men would have to advance up the beach and fight off an unknown number of enemy troops. Abercrombie's flotilla arrived at Aboukir Bay, 12 miles from Alexandria, on 1st of March 1801. For the next few days a heavy swell rolled into the bay, making it impossible to land. By the 6th of March the weather was much calmer, and preparations for landing began. After surveying the coastline, a landing point at the tip of the Aboukir Peninsula was chosen. On 7th of March, Abercrombie ordered the men to be ready at 2 a.m. the following morning. The French army that awaited the British was commanded by Jacques-François Menou, a small paunchy man of 50 years. Menou had fully invested himself in the French colonisation of Egypt. He had converted to Islam, taken a Muslim wife, and adopted the name Abdallah. This had made him a joke among the French ranks, made worse by his abrasive personality and poor leadership ability. Despite the limits of its commander, the French army, as a field force, remained hardy, disciplined, and very capable. Menou was aware of Abercrombie's presence before any assault had been made, but he refrained from concentrating his forces against the threat. Reports had also arrived of a Turkish army marching across the Sinai Desert and another British fleet in the Red Sea. Crucially, Menou did not know the exact position of the Turkish army. Was Abercrombie's force in Aboukir Bay merely a diversion? If Menou marched against the British, were the Turks close enough to attack his rear, or worse still, occupy Cairo? Against these divergent threats, Menou adopted a defensive stance, keeping the bulk of his forces inside Alexandria and Cairo, much to the annoyance of his subordinates. It is clear with the benefit of hindsight that this was a mistake. The French could have quite easily concentrated their forces against Abercrombie before facing the Turks and then Baird's Anglo-Indian army. The immediate consequence of Menou's decision was that on the morning of the 8th of March, General Louis Friant possessed only 2,000 men to repel the British amphibious assault, although outnumbered Friant was unconcerned. He was convinced that the British would not dare to attempt such a hazardous attack. Meanwhile, a few miles offshore, a rocket launched from the flagship HMS Foudroyant at 2 a.m. This was the signal for the British to get into their landing boats. At 3 a.m. a second rocket was launched and the boats began their journey to the shore. It was 8 a.m. before all of the landing craft had been formed in line, just out of French artillery range. Some had been waiting for hours in their allotted positions. Others, from the more distant ships, took seemingly forever to arrive, having rowed several miles from their troop ships. As the last of the boats got into position, there was a pause of 15 minutes as the line was dressed and the oarsmen rested before the final push into the shore. The whole force was about 5,500 strong. On its flanks were several sloops, bomb vessels and gunboats, anchored with their broadsides facing the beach. They could not risk anchoring too close inshore, and their fire would be long-range and inaccurate. On board the bomb vessel HMS Tartarus, Abercrombie gave the signal to advance. Vicious, rambling salvos from the anchored warships launched their projectiles over the assault force, sending distant plumes of sand high into the air. The boats sprang forward, the oarsmen pulling hard against the breeze blowing from land. The French were not visible, but their presence was betrayed by the smoke plumes from cannon fire, followed by the booming reports. 3 landing craft were hit by round shot, spilling their human contents into the sea. Frantic seconds passed as men were picked up by the boats following. A howitzer shell burst amongst the boat of the Coldstream Guards, killing all on board and spraying the nearby landing craft with splinters of wood and bodies. Red splodges in the sea told where the boats had been. As the assault line reached 300 yards from shore, the incoming fire changed. Instead of the shot and shell which could send a boat straight to the bottom, storms of grape shot and canister whipped into the water like hailstones. Some of the leading boats slowed almost to a standstill as dead or dying oarsmen outnumbered the living. Whilst the French fire had reduced several boats to bloody rags, the British advance continued. The majority of landing craft arrived on the beach in parade order, seemingly oblivious to the carnage around them. Up to the last moment, Friant seemed incredulous that the landing was intended. If the British succeeded in forming up 5,500 infantry on the beach, Friant's 2,000 men would face certain defeat. His only hope was to break up the attack on the waterline. As the British leapt from their boats onto the beach, Friant sent his infantry rushing down the sandhills to pour fire on them. The right of the British line, commanded by John Moore, landed at the foot of a large steep sandhill and was protected from much of the incoming fire. Moore led the charge straight up the hill. Men scrambled on all fours as the steep sand shifted underfoot. Bursting over the crest of the hill, they charged the French artillery. Within a few minutes, Moore and his men had cleared the height that dominated the beachhead and captured the guns that had caused such carnage amongst the landing craft. On the British left, beyond the shelter of the large sandhill, the fighting was more confused. British and French infantry were embroiled in close-hand combat, and casualties mounted. French cavalry charged the British from the left in an attempt to break up their formations before they could be fully formed. More British infantry were arriving on the beach all the time, and the weight of their fire checked the French charge and forced them back. At this moment, Friant recognised that further attempts to break up the British landing would be futile, and gave orders to withdraw further back on the peninsula. From the deck of HMS Tartarus, Abercrombie had watched the first boats land. Aware of Abercrombie's habit for needlessly risking himself on the front line, his general staff had ordered the commander of the Tartarus to prevent him from leaving the ship. Abercrombie simply ignored the naval officer and was on the beach before the fighting was over. As the general leapt ashore, the beach was already a hive of activity. Boats were landing all along the waterline, bringing fresh reinforcements, ammunition and artillery. Thousands of men were scrambling to move the supplies as they stepped over the loose sand and the bodies of the dead. The cries of the wounded added to the cacophony of noise. Dozens of surgeons on the beach were already dressing wounds and extracting musket balls from the unfortunate victims where they had fallen. The landing had been completed within a few minutes, and the losses had been heavy. 715 men had been killed or wounded, and 137 were missing, many of whom were presumed drowned. The French had suffered more lightly. Sheltered by the sand dunes, they had been able to retreat with very few losses due to the lack of British cavalry and artillery. The casualties did not obscure the significance of the British victory. Abercrombie's army had accomplished an extremely hazardous enterprise, and the effect on morale was huge. General Eyre Coote, who commanded the brigade on the left of the line, wrote, "The French were astonished and struck with awe at the boldness of the undertaking. Nothing can exceed this disembarkation, certainly the first and most glorious act of valour that is imaginable." Although there is nothing remarkable about an army of 5,000 forcing 2,000 enemy soldiers to retreat, it had been achieved in the most difficult of circumstances. Well, we will leave the British campaign in Egypt 1801 there for the moment, but we will continue with the concluding part in a couple of weeks' time. Do remember to go and check out our Patreon campaign, and if you so feel inclined, sign up as a patron at patreon.com/The History Network. We really do appreciate every one of you who has done so. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Simon Quinn, read by Nick Barker.